Hello everyone and welcome to our final webinar in our embroidery series. This is Embroidery Small Lettering 101. I'm Brendan Prasner, Product Marketing Manager and Evangelist here at Deco Network, and it's my pleasure to introduce our resident embroidery guru. You probably read his columns and his articles on magazines, websites and blogs, or probably even just seen him around the web giving his endless flow of free online advice and information related to embroidery. Of course, it's Mr. Embroidery himself, Eric Campbell. G'day, Eric.
G'day, Brendan. It's good to have you here. Also presenting with me, if people don't know, Brendan also has a background in digitizing, so he may kick in if I can stop talking long enough to let him. But I don't know if I'm any kind of guru, but I'm certainly happy to share what I know.
I appreciate it. Well, we've already got the questions coming in, so I think it's going to be quite a good session. So, Eric, I'll hand over to you and we'll get straight into it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Brendan. All right, folks, so as you can see, the topic is Small Lettering 101, and I will say this is really a 101 kind of thing. We're not going to be able to get into all of the intricacies of digitizing small lettering, but I am going to give you some tips that will help you, and if you listen to some of these basic tips, they will really help you either in digitizing, editing, using keyboard lettering, any kind of lettering you need to do. So in this session, what we're going to cover is the 5mm rule, and you can see that's in quotes because it's not exactly a rule, but guideline, and we'll talk about that. Editing keyboard text will help you to make keyboard text work better for smaller sizes. Think thin. This is about thin threads, and everybody has heard about 60-weight thread, but if you haven't heard much about it, we're going to talk about it in a little more detail and a couple of other threads you may not have heard of. Straight stitch text, we're going to cover that in a little bit of detail. Once you get past a certain point, you really can't use satin stitch text because it gets to be too small to execute correctly, so we'll talk about that. And the last one, if you've been in on the last webinar about caps, you may have already heard a bit about it, but what I like to call the handshake distance. And that's a little bit about the way that your embroidery is viewed and what you can use from that to talk to your customer about small lettering and small detail. And at the end here, Q&A. Really go ahead and use that question panel. We are hoping to do a fair amount of Q&A. We'll hang out for a while. We can't stay forever, but I'll get as much of that answer as I can. And the things that we can't answer there, we can email or address them later. So feel free to get those questions in. But before we begin, the one thing I always want to say is that there's more to tiny text than technical difficulty. To execute the small lettering, we certainly must understand the interaction between needle, thread, and fabric, but even so, stitching tiny text isn't always the right call. So as we cover all the technical details about stitching tiny text, remember that when we get to the end, we talk about the handshake distance. Part of that is how to discuss with your customer what is a good idea to stitch for tiny text and what isn't. So as we go through here, keep it in your head that, yes, it's great to do small lettering. We're going to talk about those small details and what we need to do to make them happen. But as embroiderers, I always suggest you need to be consultants. You need to help your clients to understand the best way to present their brand. And sometimes making the text and the details on their logo smaller, and even if you can execute them finely, this is always the best idea for what they're trying to do with their promotional products. So keep that in mind. So let's start off with something we've all heard, the 5mm rule. And the 5mm rule essentially states that your smallest letter in text, and we're talking about 40-weight standard thread here, should be about 5mm tall. The reason is that this ensures the best chance at legibility on most fabrics with 40-weight thread. The other thing you may have heard is the crayon rule, and this is something I've told people before when I'm talking to customers. You say, okay, well, you can have text as small as you like, if you can write it legibly with a new crayon. And truthfully, same thing applies here. When we're going to talk about why the 5mm rule works, it's the same reason why the crayon guideline works. It's because the smallest sure satin column is about 1 to 1.2 millimeters wide, the smallest one that will run reliably on most materials. Are there differences? Can you do smaller than this? Absolutely you can. On smooth materials especially, you can get smaller than this, but you get to a point where if you put the points too close together, you're literally dropping that needle in the same spot twice. So you get to this point where at between 0.8 and 1.2 millimeters wide is about what you need to make sure that you're going to have a stitch form and not suck into the material below. So same thing accounts for the gaps. The smallest sure open gap is about 0.8 to 1 millimeter in diameter. And what this means is, as you can see, a letter like an E, B, or lowercase e, as you see on screen, they're a stack of satin columns and gaps. And if you count each one to be roughly a millimeter, you can see that the smallest letter you can have with that sure, that kind of insured, safe satin column width is 5 millimeters. Every letter is going to be like a 5 millimeter stack. Now there are some letters, like a lowercase o only has 3 columns. It's got the column and the gap in the column if you're talking vertically. However, your top letters, the letters that have the most columns, like the E, like the G, like a lowercase g perhaps, or like this capital E, they're going to be 5 millimeter stacks. So that's why we have the 5 millimeter rule. Same thing with the crayon rule. If you look at a brand new crayon, a fresh crayon that hasn't been used, the end of that crayon's about a millimeter, 1.2 millimeter, maybe 1.5 millimeters wide. And that's why people use this crayon rule to say how you can write your text. So if you're going to have satin stitch text in standard 40 millimeter weight thread, which is important to discuss, that 5 millimeter rule, it's not that you can't go smaller than that, but it ensures the most likelihood that on multiple kinds of garments, on most of the materials you're going to work on, that your text will stand up. So safe sizes work. The reason why we work on that 5 millimeter rule and why we tend to give that to our customers as a base is that though some letters can be smaller, and you can see the piece we're working on here, the tallest letters in this rough kind of tattoo styled font that was done, it's kind of graffiti styled. The tallest letters here are about 4.7 millimeters tall, 4.8 at the very top. But as you can see, the O's in photography down at the bottom are much smaller. They're 3 millimeters. And this is with, not only is this on standard 40 weight thread with the standard 7511 needle, this is actually on a hat that has a heavy canvasy buckram behind it. It looks like it's an unstructured hat, but that's because I flattened it to get that picture just right. Now, once again, it is a 5-panel, so it wasn't that bad. It was a little bit softer than maybe a 6-panel cap, didn't go over the seam. However, even with that roughness, kind of throwing off the needle, trying to deflect the needle, we can get those 3 and 4 millimeter letters even in that 40 weight thread. However, I'm not dealing with heavy texture on the front. I'm running over some fills, so I have something to stabilize the back. So you can make some letters smaller. However, when you're working at that 5 millimeters, you can also work on custom fonts. As you can see with 5 millimeters, it usually will let you have a little bit of styling. You have some room. Whereas if you go smaller than that, you may have to sacrifice the style of the font to make sure it's legible and reads. So at that safe size, you get some letters that can be smaller. Custom fonts are possible. And what I would say is you want to measure, adjust, and repeat. And what I mean by this is you can get smaller, especially on certain garments, on certain types of materials, but you need to sew things out, see how they actually turn out, and then measure and repeat. What you'll find is because of pull and push distortions, that you're dealing with a lot of compensation at this size because it only takes a couple widths of thread to be up to 0.8 of a millimeter when you're talking about a couple passes on a satin stitch. Being that every pass of thread is about 0.4 millimeters, 2 of those passes can throw off something that's this small. It can make letters too tall or too short, and the pull on the same distance is like 0.13 to 0.17, which is about the amount of compensation in a satin stitch. How much thicker it looks on screen than what it'll run can actually throw off the look when we're talking about something this small. So when you're dealing with custom stuff, when you want to get smaller than those safe sizes, the best thing you can do is to go ahead and stitch out a sample, particularly on the material you're going to be working on, measure it, adjust the settings, adjust the shapes, and repeat that. Because it's possible, but the best thing you can do when you're talking about production, when you want to get something out quickly, is go ahead and stick with those safe sizes because that 5 millimeter rule will save you. And truthfully, it's really small. Most things will be fine. It's only in special instances that we have people really gunning for text that's smaller than that 5 millimeter rule. Editing keyboard lettering. When we want to use keyboard lettering, I mean keyboard lettering, by the reason I'm saying keyboard lettering, if you haven't heard that term before, this is pre-digitized text that comes with your system. The reason we used to call it keyboard lettering, if you've been a digitizer for a long time, is that machines used to have a keyboard with attached circuitry that had lettering packages built in, and you would just go right up to the keyboard on the machine and type out lettering and out it would come. So that's where that term comes from, but I still use it because this is the kind of lettering you can go to your keyboard and type into your software without digitizing. The lettering you saw previously on those banners, that was digitized element by element, whereas we're talking about the kind of lettering you can type straight out of your system. One of the things you're going to want to do when you're talking about getting to those really small sizes is to select lettering digitized for small sizes first. You'll find that a lot of your software packages will actually give you a prescription for what kind of size you can do in each type of lettering. Usually there'll be a chart that gives you a minimum and maximum size that they recommend for the lettering. Check those charts and see how they work. Because honestly, you will find most of the modern packages these days have small versions of fonts that are meant to work at these sizes. You'll still have to do adjustments. You are going to have to check and see that your satin stitches, especially with the levels of compensation that you've added, are up to those 1 millimeter or 1.2 millimeter thicknesses when you're trying to run that small. You may have to check that gaps are open enough. That's something we're going to talk about when we talk about editing the keyword lettering. But your best chance of them actually working are with lettering packages that have been designed specifically for small sizes. Then there are the next best selections. If you can't use those, or if you don't have a package that actually has small sizes, the next best types of lettering that tend to run well, and this is from my experience in running, I mean there are other ways you can do this, was my experiences as a digitizer, are the tall open sans serifs, and those are usually great to have condensed because they can fit in smaller spaces. What I mean by condensed is they are taller than they are wide. Those are very useful. Also just sans serifs because they don't have a lot of decoration on them. Sans serif, we're talking about something like Arial, if you don't know, or Helvetica, things like that. Swiss, those are sans serif fonts. Another ones are Roman flare serifs, and these are descended from literally from Roman stone carving, from inscriptions. That's what those Roman letters are like, and we'll show you some examples shortly. Roman flare serifs tend to be very open, and even though they have serifs, they're just small flares at the end of the strokes, and those tend to run a little better at small sizes. And then fonts with in-column serifs. If you must use a small font, and I'll show you once again, we're going to show you some examples. I would use one of the in-column serif. Those with split serifs, serifs that go opposite directions, can sometimes get too small too quickly. And this is what I mean by that. We start with our open sans serifs. We have here a condensed serif, or a sans serif font, and we have here just a standard sans serif font. These, because when you start shrinking to small size, they tend to have these large open gaps. You can get pretty small before these gaps go under that 1 millimeter size that we're looking for, that 0.8 millimeter. Also, when you're talking about like the one on the left up the top, that is condensed, so when you're trying to fight for a small area that you have to fill with text, sometimes you can get away with a little extra height, which is really the important part of making sure those counters stay open. It's the most important part, is to keep that height where it needs to be. You can get away with more text in a smaller horizontal space with a compressed font. So those are really going to be your friend when you go into small lettering. The second ones are the Roman flare serifs, and as you see down there, that Roman flare serif in the center, once again, they're very open, they're very clear to read. They have a little bit of decoration, but the decoration runs the same direction as the satin stitches, so you don't have it getting small. You end up with really small columns. They're all wide and broad, so when you shrink down, all you have to do is make sure that your smallest stitch is still at that about 1 millimeter size. And if you look at those lowercase on the right-hand side, that lowercase e, which is often one of our trouble letters, it's very open. The hook that's on the bottom is dropped far from the central stem that's there. And so those really open flare serifs are going to shrink easier. You won't have to do a lot of work to them to make them run because you can just watch those trouble areas, those gaps, and those satin stitches to make sure that you're hitting that 1 to 1.2 millimeters for that safe space. And at the bottom there we have fonts with in-column serifs. And the difference is, if you see on the left-hand side, we have a font where the serifs are split. If you look at the E and the S, the bottoms of the T's, those serifs are separate satin stitches. And if you look at the small ends on those serifs, you can see how very quickly, even at this size, we're dealing with a letter on screen. I don't know how big your screen is, but you can see how quickly that would be down to 1 millimeter in width. And when you have that, when you start to get smaller than that, you're either going to have to expand the size of those serifs to keep them, or you're going to end up eliminating them or editing them. Whereas on the right-hand side, if you have a font with in-column serifs, like the one you see on the right, those serifs are just long stitches that are pulled from the width of the column, and all you have to worry about is the main width of the column stitch itself to make sure that it ends up at that 1.2 millimeters. Now, what I will warn you about in-column serifs is when you apply any sort of pull compensation, you're going to find that those serifs are often too wide, too broad, because they seem to exaggerate those long stitches as you apply that adjustment, and you may have to pull them in a little bit to make them more reasonable. However, by far, it's easier to edit an in-column serif font and make it work at a small size than it will be to have a font that has split serifs, as you see on the left-hand side. One of the key letters that causes trouble when we're getting to very small sizes is the uppercase A. and I'm going to show you briefly how to match that A to those sure measurements we talked about. The first thing we always want to do is drop the crossbar. And the thing that you'll see is on the right-hand side in the image, the top letter has not been edited. It looks fine at a large size. It may even look fine at that medium size that is, more akin to, say, 8 millimeters. We get down to that 3 to 4 millimeter size that's on the far right-hand side, and as you can see, with the compensation, with the stroke width as thick as it needs to be to form satin stitches, with it at that 1 to 1.2 millimeters, that hole is going to close up. So the thing you want to do is drop that crossbar. Now, admittedly, what I'm going to show you is that when you drop the crossbar, sometimes it looks as if the legs at the bottom of the A are too short. You look like you have a triangle. But what I want to remind you is there's always going to be push. So when you think about push compensation, at the ends of these satin stitches, they're going to push out 0.13 to 0.2 millimeters. Essentially, they're going to push out another thread. If you think about it like that, one more thread as it's looked at right there, one more pass. So if you imagine that, those legs are actually going to extend slightly at the bottom. And so even though you may look like you have a small triangle there in your A, remember that those legs will lengthen. And as you go smaller and smaller with lettering, you may have to drop that crossbar quite a bit further to make it look proper. Just remember to get your measurement as close as you can to that 1 millimeter gap inside that triangle, and you're most likely to have it not close up on you. For the smallest lettering, some digitizers will elect to replace the crossbar in the A with a manual stitch. And as you can see, we're looking at that sample once again. On the left-hand side is an A that has not been edited. In the middle is one where the crossbar has been dropped. But on the right is one where you've replaced it with a manual stitch. And what this means is during the underlay phase, or before you stitch the top stitching, that satin stitching on the A, you will take one stitch across from the left to the right, and then back to the left, so if you're running your lettering as this is from the left to the right, and use just one double pass of a straight manual stitch to create that crossbar. Personally, I don't do this very often because it doesn't generally build up to the same thickness as the rest of the letter. When you're getting down into the very small sizes, when you are sub 4 millimeters, sometimes it is a viable option to do it, especially in lowercase lettering. If you're trying to make your lowercase lettering be much smaller than the uppercase and you're taking it below the safe distance, sometimes lowercase e's, other letters with crossbars, somebody will bring across that straight stitch, one manual stitch to make that crossbar. However, you have to see that it's not going to build up to quite the same thickness, even when the full compensation is accounted for in that small lettering as the satin stitch. So just be careful for that. It can be useful. The other thing to worry about is if you have any sort of fabric that has a lot of texture, if it has any sort of fuzzy surface, sometimes even a peach surface, sometimes that one stitch across and back won't be enough to keep it up from the surface, and it'll start to sink in. If there's some grain too, if you have any sort of horizontal grain, you should not in most garments, but if there's something like that, it can hide pretty quickly. So it is an option if you absolutely can't get that crossbar to look right, or if the bottom legs don't look right when you stitch out and you want to see if you can get a little bit more room in that area, you can use a single manual stitch, like I said, in the underlay phase before you start stitching that top stitching, and bring that across to make that crossbar. Also, I would make sure that you want to have one stitch all the way across and back. You don't want to break it in the center, especially when we're talking about lighter thread colors, especially on darker materials. You're going to find that every stitch penetration point, especially in something like a manual stitch or a straight stitch, something we're going to talk about more with straight stitch lettering later, really shows shadow and makes things break up. Sadly, what customers say when they see these things is that it looks stitchy. Now, I know to us that might be hilarious. I always thought it was something to reproach that somebody said embroidery looks stitchy, and I thought, well, of course it does, it's made of stitches. However, the difference being that in darker colors, those shadows can hide. If you've ever seen straight stitch lettering or details or a design that looks very much like an engraving or a woodcut, dark colors on light look great. Light colors on dark the lines look broken, and that's because of the shadows at each of the penetration points. So when you're making that bar, make sure to make your straight stitch all the way across and back. Using a manual stitch is a great way so you don't accidentally drop a point if it gets long. The other thing that you have to watch for is the closing up of counters in keyboard lettering. When you're dealing with letters like you see on screen, you have your capital P, R, your lowercase e, your G, you may have to drop the central bar a little bit. When you do that, you also often have to open that bowl, and what I mean is that in the counter, the enclosed space inside the top of that letter, sometimes you have to make that a little wider or a little taller, and then if you have a hook, if you have, like, say, that bottom of the G you see, or the bottom of the E, as you see on the left-hand side is the unedited version, on the right-hand side is the edited version, you may have to drop and shorten the hook. So what I mean by this is that you drop that central bar very much like the crossbar in the A, and you can see the P and the R. What we've done, we've shortened up the legs slightly, and we've opened that up so that we still have enough room to get that 1 millimeter we're looking for that sure gap. On the lowercase e, it's a little tougher because when you drop that central bar, you end up getting close to the hook, to that bottom hook that's coming over in the E. That gets too close, and what you really want to do is you're going to go ahead and drop that out a little bit. The thing that's great about this is if you look at even a true type font, any font at all, when you see a round letter, they tend to be a little taller than the square letters next to them in the font. If you type them all in a straight line, you type something out, you'll see that square top letters are a little shorter than the round letter. The reason this is because it's an actually optical correction. The I, if you make a lowercase e the same size, or let's just say you make a round letter, an O, the same size as like that R or a P or a B or an E next to it that has square tops or square bottoms, you'll see that if you make them the same size, the O will look smaller. The I just tends to make those round letters look smaller. So even in a true type font, you'll find that round letters are made a little larger in the height of the letter to account for that optical variance, to account for that the brain makes that round thing look smaller. So when you open up an E like this, when you drop the bottom hook, when you open up that top area, you open the bowl by stretching out, just dragging the control points on the top of that E open, it actually doesn't show up that much, especially in small lettering with the compensation. As you can see, even just on the small amount of reduction I've done in the second line for you to see, you don't see egregiously this massive difference with how much taller that E is when I opened up that top bowl, that top area. So you can let that E be a little taller and a little lower than the letters next to it. The I will correct for it, and as you know, when you have those legs on the P and R, they look a little short, they're going to stretch out. Same thing is true of the hook. You'll see on that G, and the same thing on the E. What I've done is I've shortened up the end of that hook a little bit, and what I mean by that is I've taken out a couple of stitches off of the end of that hook, knowing that it's going to push beyond the end of that satin stitch, that we're going to get a little bit more length on the satin stitch. Where the end isn't exactly where it's going to stop. On screen, it's going to stop further in the actual stitch out. I've pulled back a couple stitches. And the great thing you know about that is when we're dealing with full density fills, let's say that these are 0.4 or 4 points in density, that's a full density fill on a satin, that if you move back one pass of stitches, just drag back your control points to the end of a column to the previous set of straight stitches, because as you know, a satin stitch is going to have one straight pass and then one angled pass. Bring it back to that previous straight pass. You're actually taking it down about 0.4 millimeters, which gives you about 0.2 that it's going to get longer. I know this sounds like a lot of little numbers, but what it means is if you only drag it back a couple stitches, it extends by 1. You can see that you're going to end a little bit before you hit that central bar, and it's going to give you the room for it not to close up and look like you have an 8 instead of a lowercase e. So the easiest thing to do is to drop that hook, open up the top a little bit. If you can, especially on letters like the P or the R where it doesn't affect anything below it, you drop your central bar a little bit, and then you open up the hook. On the G's, E's, letters that have that hook, you can go ahead and pull a couple stitches back on your end points, and it will allow that to have more room so that it doesn't close up when it's running. With that, we're going to go ahead and get on to thin threads. And by the way, folks, please continue to ask your questions. I know that we're going a bit fast, but I know we have a lot to cover. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. So thin threads. Most people have heard, hey, if you've got small lettering, what you really want to do is get some thinner threads, and that's going to help you run. The thing is, you can run thinner threads, but there are some technical things that go on with using thinner threads that you have to be aware of. They aren't just a cure-all, and you can't necessarily just take thin threads and put them in your current design that you already have created and run them. Sometimes that'll help. If your design is already a little too dense, that might work out. But with thinner threads, you really do have to do some adjustments, and you have to be very aware of how they run and how they operate. So with thinner threads, we can indeed get smaller details. 60 weight thread which is the most popular thin thread that you can use, is about roughly 25% thinner than 40 weight standard embroidery thread. What this means is we can generally get about 25% smaller without too much hassle. If we're doing all the things we talked about earlier, right? Let's say we're making sure that our bowls are open, those counters, those holes that are in the lettering are open, that our satin stitches are of a certain width. We can usually pull that back about by 25% and get that to run pretty ably on most materials. However, the material can really affect, when we're getting this small, when you're getting to these 1 millimeter to sub-millimeter thicknesses on lettering, you can see that they start to interfere with things like the texture of the garment. You get to where even a fairly normal knit, like say on this right-hand side, you're seeing a logo that I did for the Bobo Tea Company. And as you can see, that looks like we're running on some sort of cable knit sweater, right? It's very much not. That is essentially a thick knit shirt. It's not a sweatshirt. It's not something immense. It's not huge. What's happening there, the reason it looks like that is when I'm zooming in tight enough to show you how that 60 weight thread is running, you can actually see the texture on what otherwise would look like a very normal knit shirt. And as you can see, as the thread is getting so small, as the satin stitches, say in that the letters down there for company, which the tallest letter there is 3.7 millimeters tall, as those satin stitches get thinner, they're getting to a point where just being kind of across the rib of knit on some knit materials can deflect that a little bit and move the edges around and give you a less clean edge quality on some of your lettering, because the stitches are so small they want to sink in. So you do have to be very careful with your materials. Use the proper materials and be careful with your sizing of those satins. However, in general, you can go about 25% smaller than you can with 40 weight when you're using 60 weight thread. The other thing to remember is you really need a thinner needle. Thinner needle is necessary because you're going to be dropping that needle very close to the original penetration point. When you're running fast, you don't want that needle to drop back in the hole that it just vacated. So a 65-9 needle is going to give you the fine control that you have there. But what that also means is that they deflect a little easier because they're thinner. So when you're talking about using 60 weight thread, there are some adjustments on the machine that have to be done. It's not just spinning up some 60 weight thread, throwing it through your standard setup, and putting on a logo you already have. You're going to have to adjust things to make it work. Actually, folks, I'm going to apologize. I've got one of my slides got out of order here. I'm going to go back quickly to editing keyboard lettering. This is my fault. Did some editing last night and I got something out of sequence. Let's really quickly jump back. I'm very sorry for this, folks.
All good.
I want to go back real quick to this because this is actually a pretty interesting thing about script lettering. It's something I actually haven't taught before. So we're going to go back to 60 weight thread in just a second, but let's do this real quick. When you're dealing with script fonts, and this is one of the classic script fonts everybody uses, there's real classic brush script. When you're dealing with getting that to a smaller size, there's just 3 tips that are really easy to make it work better. The first thing is to reduce the skew angle. If you're in software like, I'm going to go ahead and say Wilcom, it's what I use, so it's something I'm more familiar with, where you can change the angle of the skew of lettering, or say it says italic somewhere, that you can change how quote-unquote italic just by the means of the angle of the lettering. You want to reduce that. In this particular sample, on the top is lettering that hasn't been edited. In the center is lettering where all I've done is go negative 10 degrees. That's all I did. I brought the skew back by 10 degrees, and you can already see how that lowercase e is opened up quite a bit. The next thing is, I say open to counters. What a counter is, it's a technical typography term for the gap inside of a letter, usually a round one, and I may be using it incorrectly, but let's just say the gap inside of that E is what I mean by the counter. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the bottom version of the text, I've dropped the center bar and opened up that hole so it's as large as I can get it, where without it looking too odd or having the middle bowl, that curve that's at the top of the E, or in the center of the E, getting too close to that bottom curve that leads up into the S. You can pull that entire column right to the halfway point so that there's an equal amount of space between the top curve of the E and the middle curve, the loop, and then the bottom curve that goes up into the S. You can actually make that equal. And as you can see here, it looks a little strange zoomed, but it looks better stitched. Once you get it to its actual size, it's not very noticeable. What is noticeable is that your lowercase e's don't close anymore. So I apologize for being out of order, guys. So we're going to go back to thin threads and remember the 60 weight stuff. We're going to talk about that again, how 60 weight thread is thinner. and the 25% smaller text, just remember that, and 65.9 needle, but we're going to go ahead and recapitulate that. So sorry about that, guys. All right, so let's go back to thin threads again. We're at the 60 weight thread. We already know it's 25% thinner. We can get 25% smaller, but here are the things you have to do to get 60 weight thread to work. You're going to have to adjust your digitizing. 60 weight thread being 25% thinner, if you have just the right amount of coverage in your design, that means that you're going to have 25% less coverage if you move directly to 60 weight thread from the design you were already using. So if you use an existing design, you're usually going to find that your coverage may be a little lacking. If your design is rather dense, if you find that it balls up and that the lettering itself is standing up very proud back and front because it has too much thread buildup, you may get away with it. But generally, you're going to have a digitizer who knows you're going to use 60 weight thread if you're not doing it yourself and has made the proper adjustments, meaning that you can have up to 25% more density. You usually don't have to go quite that far depending, but you do have to use some differences in your digitizing to get it to work. Also, generally, you shouldn't have lettering that's that small as you can get with 60 weight thread in your 40, so if you're trying to get to that size, you're probably having somebody specifically digitize for that size in the first place. What I will say is I have taken an entire logo. Now, the logo on the right, some of that logo is in 40 weight thread, so that not everything had to run in the 60. The top of the logo is actually in 40 weight and the bottom is in 60. If you were running something entirely in 40 weight thread, you could take a design, and if you weren't processing it, and what I mean by that is you're not taking it into a software that's going to reprocess the density, you're just sizing it, you can actually shrink the design and run it with 60 weight thread if it was at the proper densities already. Once again, up to 25%, provided everything's digitized right. However, I would really recommend that when you're using 60 weight thread to have it digitized specifically for that 60 weight thread and to work with a digitizer who knows how to use it. Second thing is I'm going to tell you to use underlay. Sometimes with small lettering, because it is finicky and sometimes can interact with things like I talked about earlier, like the thread grain and move left and right across, say, a rib of knit, as you can see in the bottom, people will cut the underlay out because they have trouble with the underlay popping out of the design. I don't like to do that because I find that you end up with a lot more chance of the top stitching looking broken and shifting. Use underlay. I would recommend a double pass of single stitch underlay, straight stitch right down the center. Usually that center walk underlay is enough depending on what you're working on, but a lot of the times when you have people who have underlay popping out, what they really have is an edge walk underlay or what's called a contour underlay that's running close to the edges, and it's just a little too close to the edges that it's falling toward the outside as it's running. If you tighten that up and use a center walk underlay instead, usually it's all right, and honestly, underlay lifts that top stitching and it provides a platform for the top stitching to ride on like a rail so that it doesn't suck down into the garment. And since we're dealing with really small stitches, that's going to be helpful here. So a couple passes of that single run center underlay. I like to do a lot of it manually. Will help you out. Another thing I often do is to manually underlay an entire letter instead of doing it piece by piece. On some substrates, on some garments that have some texture, doing that can keep it from breaking when you change from one set and column to another. It's not necessary all the time, but it will help if you have things like, say, there's breaks in the A where it covers, or you've got some different breaks where you have the intersection of a T. Sometimes underlaying the entire letter first will help. The only problem with that is you may have a little bit of extra travel underlay, which might thicken up an area if you have to travel after you've already underlaid the whole letter. So definitely use underlay, and like I said, just keep it away from your edges because you're not going to have room for the compensation. This also is going to require tension adjustment. As you can imagine, the way that a machine puts tension on thread is by clamping it between two discs that slip a bit. And if you're going to put thread that's 25% thinner through there, it's going to reduce the amount of tension that's on the thread. So go to your thread manufacturer's charts, go to your gauges if you have them, and adjust your tension on your 60 weight thread because it's going to affect how that runs. Another thing is, like I said before, your substrate, by which I mean the fabric you're running on the garment, can affect your outcome. If you want to run little tiny lettering on incredibly coarse materials, you're going to have some trouble. If you run, say, you've got tote bag canvas and you're running 3mm lettering, that tote bag canvas is definitely going to deflect a thin needle. It's going to bend the thin needle as it runs, no matter if you're using a sharp needle or not, and it is going to cause some what I would call stair stepping, those rough stepped edges as things go across the thick wales, the thick grain of that material. So the substrate's going to affect your outcome. I wouldn't suggest doing the tiniest lettering possible on rough, thick knits or thick wovens that have heavy materials. Backpacks sometimes will be like that too, you know, ballistic nylon, things like that, that have a really thick, heavy gauge to the individual cords of fiber running through the material itself will affect that outcome. One of the things you definitely want to use a water-soluble topping. If you're using it on something that has some texture, a water-soluble topping will help to alleviate some of that trouble. You may still have interaction between the needle and the fabric itself, but at least it'll allow the stitching to ride up above the surface before it drops down into that surface when it's tight, and it will be on those small, thin satin stitches, as you can see here. So when you're using thin threads, you're definitely going to want to have digitizing done for it. Use underlay to keep that top stitching up above the level of the garment. Make sure your tensions are right, and realize that substrates can affect your outcome. Your garment can affect your outcome, so it's not always advisable for very thick materials or materials that are going to have a very coarse weave. They will sometimes cause trouble. You can affect that somewhat by using fills underneath for some materials if they're soft enough to take that much stitching, but there are certain heavy gauge materials that are just going to deflect that needle no matter what you do. And now we come to an Outlier 75 weight thread. And I'm going to mention it just because I've had people mention it to me. This is a piece I did, and you're looking at it, that is absolutely a real photograph next to a dime. 75 weight thread is incredibly fine. It feels very much like you're threading up a machine with hair when you use 75 weight thread. It requires a very, very fine needle, 68 needle. It's also not available in very many colors right now. Is it usable? Absolutely, it's usable. It can do incredible things if you want to, but it's best on smooth surfaces. The surface that you see over the right that looks like it's something like tote bag canvas, you're looking at a standard button-up twill shirt, I believe. It's either a twill or a poplin shirt. So we're talking about a dress shirt. This is an incredibly fine, smooth material, and at the size that 75 weight thread is, it looks like it's big and coarse when I zoom in enough for you to see this material. So it's going to be best on smooth surfaces. You can imagine that these very tiny stitches are not going to do well on something that sinks or something that's rough. And like I said, the needle deflects incredibly easily. Even the needle itself feels like you're handling hair. It's like a noodle. It's so, compared to a needle you're used to running, or say if you're running a thicker gauge needle for either thick materials, or sometimes people run a thicker needle for running metallics, the difference between that and the needle you're running for 75 weight is incredible. So is there 75 weight thread out there in the world? Yes, it is. You can go even smaller than the 60 weight, and you can do incredible things with it, but it's not something that I would necessarily put into production for everything. If all I was running, and say this is for the American Academy of Pediatrics, and as you can see, we've got some, sub 3 millimeter satin stitch lettering going on here. Yes, you can run it, and if I was only ever going to run, say, scrubs or doctor's jackets that were very flat material, very finely grained, and I was never going to touch a piqué polo or something with a basket weave knit or something that might have literally gaps in the knit that were thick enough to swallow up one of these satin stitches, maybe I can see setting up a program to do it, but it's not something I would necessarily do in production for every day. Is it interesting? Yes. Is it cool looking? Yes. Does this sample look cool up in person? Absolutely. I was, gobsmacked when I ran it. But 75 weight thread is maybe not for everybody's production schedule, whereas 60 weight thread is absolutely a lot easier to work with and can fit into most of your production and be used directly on piqués and on polos, things like that, things that have a little bit of texture to them. So is there 75 weight thread? Yes, there is. Should you use it? It's up to you. It depends on what you're selling on. It could be a unique value proposition if your clients really love these tiny letters, but it's not something I would necessarily recommend for everybody. Another thread that people don't always know as 50 weight metallic. There's not necessarily a ton of colors in the 50 weight as compared to standard thicknesses or even thicker thread metallics, but there are some companies that have 50 weight metallic, and it does run smoother than the thicker metallics that are twisted. And I'm showing you here once again, this is absolutely a real picture next to a dime. You can see I've used that Roman flare serif font I was talking about earlier because it stays so nice and open, though I did still drop my crossbar on that A in Darby and in department down there. But a 50 weight metallic is just a little thinner than a 40 weight, and it allows for a smoother finish and for smaller text. I mean, it's still going to be a little rough. Metallics are rough because generally what you have is a core of fiber that's wrapped in some kind of foil. Same thing here. So you're going to see little kinks in the foil as it runs. That's why metallic looks sparkly, is you have little kinked bits of foil. But the 50-weight metallic does run smoother than the thicker metallics, and you can run it through a 7511 needle. I mean, you can run it through a smaller needle. Personally, I don't ever want to have a smaller eye with metallics because that's going to increase the friction and increase the chance of thread breaks. So 50-weight metallic is great in the 7511 needle, and most designs won't need editing for coverage because the metallics lay the way they do and they have that wrapped foil core. If you use a fairly normal digitized design that's been well digitized, has nice balanced densities, with that 50-weight metallic, you'll usually get enough coverage and you'll find that it actually runs a lot more like a 40-weight. Because, since, like I said, metallic has a little bit more surface texture. It's going to be a little thicker maybe than it should be at that size, but it runs very much like a 40-weight, and with the nice 50-weight metallics, you do get a decent letter that looks, I'd say, much cleaner than with a standard metallic. So look for those 50-weight metallics as another option for a thinner thread. So let's go back and in general about thin threads. When you want to implement 60-weight thread, a great way to do this is to take 1 or 2 needles per head. Say you've got a 15-needle machine. Very rarely are you going to be running designs that are all 15 colors, and you absolutely have to have them all rolled out and in 40-weight threads. So what I would say is you take 1 or 2 needles per head and get the proper needles for them, get them tensioned correctly for 60-weight thread, and leave them that way constantly. That way you're not switching back and forth, messing with tensions, trying to change your needles out. Leave those couple of needles there just for doing the small lettering. It will be useful for you, and then you can just leave your couple of most popular colors ready to rock on that 60-weight thread on each head. And if your production staff's well aware of that and keeps that as a rule, then it's very easy for you to plan to use 60-weight, and it's easy for your digitizer, or if you're digitizing yourself, to just make sure you go ahead and specify that 60-weight when you're putting that back for production. So keeping those needles set and the tensions adjusted, like I said, keep them set, don't switch them back and forth, and you're just going to be a lot happier. If you're just doing maintenance adjustments instead of wide adjustments to go back and forth between different types of threads, you'll be happier. The other thing is you want to run at a measured pace. When you're running this material, you have to realize that 60-weight thread, especially if you're dealing with polyester has a tendency to be a little springy in the first place. Now we have a thinner needle that has a tendency to bend a little easier than your 7511 standard needle. You're going to want to pull back a little bit on your speed, because as speed increases, and this is true of all embroidery, if you're having very minor troubles in a design, you're having just a little bit of registration trouble, just a little bit of issue with some shifting, or maybe with a little bit of compensation, like the satins are getting too thin, back down your speed just a little bit. I mean, I know you're definitely sacrificing a little bit of your production time to do so, but you may find that the extra stress as you increase that speed is what's causing your trouble, because the faster we run, the less time the material has to relax between stitches, and the less time the thread itself has to relax. It increases the kind of strain that's on the design. If you run something really fast and then run it slower, you'll see the difference in how much satin stitches get thinner and such. And I'll admit also, I've done it the other direction. If I've had satin stitches that are running a little too thick, I run a little faster, and you can find that sometimes that will thin them up, because it does make a difference with how much compensation you need. So what I'd say is, really, when you're working with 60-weight threads, because you're working with something where your needle can deflect a little easier, and you may have issues with where that needle drops, and like I said before, interacting with the weave of the material itself, with the knit of the material, run at that measured pace, back down your speeds just a little bit, and you're going to have better results with that 60-weight thread. A lot of people get upset because they realize, oh wow, now I have to stock my entire run of colors again in the 60-weight thread if I'm going to be doing that text like that. But what I would say is the likelihood that your text is in every color that you run is pretty low. Start by stocking maybe your top 5 colors, or I mean top 2 if you have to. White and black is the first thing that most everybody starts with. In my particular shop that I was running, I started with white, black, navy blue, gold, and red. Now, the thing is, that's partially regional. I'm from New Mexico, and if you know that, our flag is a big gold field with a red Zia on it, and a lot of our logos, a lot of our designs harken back to that. So that gold and that deep red were necessary even for text because they're going to be on a lot of things. It may be different in your location. If you have a school and the colors are, let's say, burnt orange and white, make sure that burnt orange, if it's going to be on a lot of stuff you're going to run, buy that as one of your top 5 colors. But you may just do a review, a casual review, and say, okay, what are the colors I use the most for text? And stock those top 5 colors first for your machine. If you decide that you want to run a ton of 60-weight thread, that's great. Then you can continue to stock up after that. But you don't have to start by buying the entire thread catalog. I mean, most of us know it's very few shops that have the entire thread catalog from one brand, or heck, that don't have several brands. Our shop ran almost 5 brands, I believe, most of the time. Once again, that's another one lovely New Mexico problem. You have to have a lot of turquoise out here, and not everybody has the turquoise you need. So we ran several brands. You don't have to stock everything in your 60-weight thread. Start with those top 5 colors. It's going to cover a lot of the stuff you do. Also, if you do, this is another one, police and fire, you may have what we like to call a Vegas gold, which is, it's the thread that harkens back to a metallic gold or brass color. You may have to have that for your small text too. I know that's another one we ran a ton of. So start with your top 5 colors. You don't have to stock up the entire shop with all the colors in the world. Do remember your stitch count is going to increase, and you also have to remember that if you're going to slow down and run at a measured pace, you're going to slow down a bit. If you're going to use tons of 60-weight thread for folks, I would suggest that you think about that when you're doing your charges. Now, usually because you're also making the lettering much smaller, you're not going to see much increase in the stitch count. But if they decide, as I've had some of my clients do, that they like the look of the fineness of the 60-weight thread, that Boba T logo that you saw earlier eventually was transitioned to being all 60-weight thread because they liked the look of the fineness of the thread as part of the texture of their design. Now, they were very picky customers, hence why we started 60-weight thread working with them. You will have some increased stitch counts, and make sure that your folks know that when you're working with that 60-weight thread. Especially if you haven't changed the size of your lettering, the stitch counts will increase subtly, and it may be reflected in your quoting. Also, once again, remember your substrate and your support materials. Always think about the garment you're going on. Not every garment is a great candidate for tiny lettering that's unsupported. And remember your support materials. Get that water-soluble topping that's going to help those small stitches not to sink in. Now, straight stitch text. We'll run through this carefully, but this is only used when you don't have enough room to have lettering thick enough for satin stitches. The second thing is it's best digitized manually. There are straight stitch fonts, and some of them work all right, but some of the connectors between them and the fact that it runs one letter at a time can cause issues depending on where you are with your passes and trying to get everything in the right number of passes and not have connectors. And what that means is, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, straight stitch lettering only looks even if every letter and every stroke on every letter has the same number of passes of thread. If you only go over it twice, that's really the gold standard, is you want to go over every line twice and no more, because when you're talking about these straight stitches, if you go over one more time, you've added half again as much thickness to that stroke of the letter. So it's best digitized manually so that you can control those strokes and the thickness of the letters. Also, it's best in dark colors. Like I said earlier, you're going to have light colors. We're going to show shadows, and they're going to look broken and quote-unquote stitchy if you don't handle them in any other way. It's best on the dark colors, dark color thread on a lighter ground if you can. Now, some people will be okay with those lighter colors and deal with it looking quote-unquote stitchy, like I said, but it is something that not all customers love. Once again, best on smooth surfaces. If your surface has too much grain, and I'm not talking about here you can see this is actually a larger piece with very thick thread. The piece that's on the left is actually 12-weight thread, and it's incredibly thick and woolly. The reason I've used straight stitch text there is because it's so thick and woolly that I can't do even normal size thread satin stitch text that I would do for 40-weight, and so I elected to use a straight stitch text style so that I could get nice open fonts going top and bottom on this logo that was used for some knitwear. It was tags for knitwear. So any place you can't use satins, it does scale depending on the thread you're using. But when we're talking about smooth surfaces, what I mean is if something has grain, like if it's a ribbed knit, then the vertical lines in a ribbed knit are often going to suck in the vertical lines that are in your straight stitches. So you're going to end up losing those vertical lines. When you do that, those pieces are going to disappear, and this text will look broken, won't be very legible. Also, it's most legible in all caps just because you can get the wide open areas in the lettering the way that you would expect. So it is most legible in all caps. You can do it in other ways. I'm actually going to show you other examples where it's not in all caps, but in all caps when you're getting very small is just the best chance you have at this being legible in any way, shape, or form. So with straight stitch text, like I said, you want to maintain uniform thickness, meaning that when you digitize the text, I'm going to show you a little bit live if I can here shortly, you want to pass across it only twice. You want to move from one side of the entire word or entire phrase, if you can connect the two, from one end to the other, and then all the way back, only passing over each line twice. That maintains uniform thickness so that you don't have thick knots or balls. And what you'll end up seeing is thread will knot up or ball up, and you'll have a big thick knot at one end. It's the reason you also want to avoid tie-in and tie-off stitches. You want to have this lead from another element if you can, or realize that when you're that small, generally what a tie-off stitch is are 3 small stitches, maybe a millimeter, maybe a little under, that tie the material down. Usually, if you're doing straight stitch text, it itself will be so small, the individual stitches, that they will avoid pulling out like you would with, say, the end of a satin stitch usually. So avoid using really thick tie stitches, or only back over the last stitch once if you have to, or if you can, lead in and out of another element. As you can see in the piece on the right here, it's actually done in 40 weight thread, but this is 40 weight matte finish thread, which tends to run a little thinner. It looks a little thinner, has less texture than a regular finished thread. And you see the orchards up in the upper right-hand corner. It's not perfect, but you can read it. It is legible at that incredibly small size. The other thing you want to do, you want to space lines further apart than fill density. The thing people forget is they get down zoomed in on a really small piece trying to do these straight stitch letters, and then they have their lettering so close to each other that they measure about the same distance that you would have for lines so close together that the eye reads them as a solid fill or almost as a satin stitch. You're going to have to make sure to use your measurement tool in your software. Almost all software is going to have a tool to help you measure, or to watch the grid behind your software, behind your digitizing software. And I like to use a grid of about 1.5 millimeters, which I'll show you shortly, and that helps me tell about how far apart I am with my lines, and make sure they're further apart than there would be for fill density. You may have to do a quick test. I mean, these are incredibly fast running elements, so you may have to go over to your machine, run something out and check it and see that you're not getting too close together. Though, as you can see up there in that text that says the orchards, it is legible without being entirely perfect, and you can get close together or even have letters use pieces of the next letter in their shape without your mind or your eye having the trouble breaking them apart. You can make straight stitch lettering that isn't perfect, that does show the lettering and that intimates what you're looking for. Last thing on this page is that you want to watch angles over fills or fabric grain. And what this means is when you're running the straight stitch lettering over a fill, you want to try and make sure that, like I talked about with the ribbed material or knit material that had a vertical grain, you don't want land. They're going to sink into the fill underneath them, especially at these really small sizes, and you're going to lose pieces of your letter. So you want to be very careful with your angles over those fills and fabric grain, and make sure that between the 2 points of any stitch in your small lettering that it crosses over a stitch that's underneath it and doesn't fall between 2 stitches. Because like I said, we're dealing with really, really small text here. If something lines up with the angle of the fill that's underneath it, you will see stitches start to sink in. The other tips are to digitize in tours. And what I mean by that is that, like I said before, you want to go from the left. We have this word here. And honestly, people always comment on how great they think this looks. And to me, I think this isn't the best example of straight stitch text. The reason I want to say that is the third point here is to insinuate the shapes in the lettering, because you're not going to get a perfect run. This is a little logo text that says Sabrosito. This was a piece that I did for Better Call Saul, actually, as a prop. And when you run this out, from any viewing distance, it looks pretty good. However, it doesn't look exactly like the text or the logo. When you're dealing with something that's, the important part is that it looks like the logo, not that it's legible, it's okay to insinuate the shapes in the lettering to get close to what they look like and leave enough open spaces that they are legible and that you can read them. It's not going to necessarily be perfect, and that's all right. But to digitize in tours means on this particular piece, I ran all the way from the left to the right for the one pass and then came and completed everything from the right to the left on the other pass. And that's, like I said before, digitizing in tours means that you go out to one end and you trace your steps back to the other end, making sure that every piece gets those 2 passes, like I said. Also, like I said, err on the side of open spacing and counters. When you're working on top of a logo or some other text, a great habit is to run these straight stitches around the outside edge of the letters instead of in the dead center of the satin or of the columns that you would usually use to make a satin stitch. If you're running up these really small sizes, running that toward the outside edge will just make you get in the habit of leaving the inside of like this lowercase a open, this O open as much as you can. Also, just has to be the case. Every run may be slightly different. When you get to these incredibly small sizes, it only takes a little bit of wiggle in the needle or a little bit of deflection to go on one side or another of, say, a line of fill that's underneath it or of a rib that's in the knit. So you're not going to always have exact perfect runs on straight stitch text when it gets to the smallest sizes. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to switch off to my digitizing software and see if I can show you just a little bit about straight stitch text before we go on. So if it bows out, I will let you know. This is just a little tiny piece that says Deco Network. You can see how small that is on screen. The actual height of that is under 3 millimeters, 2.8, but it is something that will run. I'm going to zoom in tight so you can actually see what I'm working with. So that's what we have in the Deco Network piece. What I'm going to show you first, these are actually the 2 passes, the tours. I split them into 2 passes. This initial pass starts from that left. And all I'm trying to do in this particular pass, and there's multiple ways you can do this as long as you are careful to remember to only make the 2 passes, right? But this one, all I did was go from the left to the right in the quickest manner I could, keeping everything connected. Now, some of you are going to notice that we have these sub-millimeter connecting stitches here. You don't usually want to run a stitch smaller than a millimeter, but if you ever notice the side of one of your fills, generally a fill has a setting of a minimum stitch of 0.4 millimeters, you can do a couple of these before they start causing thread breaks. So if you really need to separate things like this O-N-E sequence that has to have some separation, you can drop a small connector here. Or if you have a longer connector, sometimes you can actually drop a center stitch penetration point right in the middle to make this actively sink down a little bit, the connector that's between letters. But truthfully, at the size it is, as real size, you generally won't see those connectors. They won't be obtrusive. But the first tour goes from left to the right in the most expedient fashion possible, and then the next tour goes back across, filling things back in as I go. Now I'm actually going to go ahead and rerun this for you so you can actually watch that work. As you can see, and then you can actually see each pass separated. Every spot is only ever covered twice, and that's going to give you a uniform thickness across. Here's a piece. You can't see it great because of the 3D preview on this one. This is a piece that I did for NBC's The Night Shift, and it actually has some small text, and I've separated this out so you can see it run too. This was actually done a little bit differently, but let's go ahead and watch it run. Each word is gone all the way from the left to the right, back from the right to the left. Now in these ones I did some more of the work on the first pass than the second pass, which is fine. You can do that. The reason why most people go straight to the end in the first tour is because sometimes it can be hard to remember or to see if you've covered an area entirely. And so they like to just go in that expedient path because it makes it easier to remember the text on the way back. But as long as you only go over each piece twice, you're set. You don't have to worry too much about it. Go ahead and go to this one. This is Socorro County Detention Center, and in the center of the state seal, and these do run, and they look fairly legible, is the state seal of New Mexico text. And I'm going to split that out. Let's watch it run real quick. As you can see, each letter is done separately. When I have a seal with a circle around it, I will then use the seal edge to travel. But as you can see, every sequence that sticks together goes all the way from one side to the end and then tours back across. Then for the last one, it's going to cover more than one kind of small stitching. This was a big piece I did for Torrance County Sheriff's Office. Now, though it's a large piece, you can see this also has the great seal in the center. And what I'd like to point out here is the difference between straight stitches in dark and light. Now this is something the customer requested and they liked this effect, but as you can see, these light Vegas gold straight stitches, even in areas where I attempted to offset the stitch penetration somewhat, it still looks very stitchy and broken. Even if you try and offset the straight stitches from one piece to the other, they will still sometimes line up. These ones are fairly lined up on both passes, and it looks much more broken. Now from the actual viewing distance, it doesn't look awful, but I always say if you're doing straight stitch lettering, which does look broken, that can cause issues. However, what you don't see, this is once again actually a photo of the sample, this incredibly small text here, and this is actually still 40 weight thread. I'm going to go ahead and show you the digitized sample itself. And as you can see, one of the things that's important here, when we get in tight, you'll see how I had to be careful to keep my stitches from lining up exactly with the angle back here. This is the angle of the fill, and I had to make sure that each of these individual stems of the letters crossed over the fill behind it to make sure it didn't fall in. And as you can see, it did not fall in. The pieces were still pretty visible. We had a little bit of pull compensation issue, but not too bad. And like you see, actually right here in the R, next in CR in the crescit at the beginning of the Latin statement here, that stem could have been lengthened. I could have been more careful because it did sink in a little bit and get shorter than it should have been. So it's really important when you're working with really small text. You can see that actually it ended up sinking into a piece of the angle from where this banner had the other little section of banner behind it, and I had the angle turning a little too far, and it made a couple of those pieces line up and sink in. But once again, we'll go ahead and replay just that portion for you. And once again, we can see how you can just use this really big, broad, straight stitch. It's also definitely it's all caps. It has no character to letters whatsoever. And you can see things like this, the I in crescit is actually used to travel between the C and the T and is not exactly spaced perfectly, but when you go back to the original piece, it still reads pretty well, and the I lets it separate fairly well as well. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It can just intimate the shapes that are there. And frankly, we're going to get to the last point. It's not always all that critical that you can read those things. Now, these people were very happy that I managed to make that fairly legible. However, I find that it's not always that particularly necessary to have that work that way. And what I always want to bring up is the handshake distance. Now that we've talked about all these technical ways that you can make this work, I'd like to talk about what you can tell your customers, your clients, to maybe dissuade them from using this incredibly tiny text all the time. And my favorite term for this is the handshake distance. If you were here for the CAP webinar, you've already heard this bit, but I can say this certainly. I think it's probably one of the most important things I'm telling you today, and you should definitely listen in, because this will change some of the discussion with your more reasonable clients. And we all know not all clients are reasonable, but for the ones that are, this is a very good argument to help them back away from constantly making everything so small. The handshake distance is something that was actually born out of a study in the 60s that was done on the distance of an American handshake between strangers. And now, not every one of us is American, I know, but this is just a good average thing to understand. Usually, that handshake is going to be between 2 and 4 feet between those two people when they're doing a normal handshake. They're not going to be necessarily that close to each other. So if you think about this, in any design you're doing, whether it's on a hat or on your left chest, the distance between the person who's looking at that logo and the logo itself is between 2 and 4 feet. So my rule is that if you can't see something, or if something isn't legible from about 3 feet away, you won't see it at all. And the reason why this is important is that because most of the clients, if they're doing stuff with you as a business especially, the text that's on there is important to them because it's something that they want to communicate to the person who's viewing it. The person who's looking at this, this particular piece, whether it's a uniform left chest or a hat, whatever it is, they're putting something on there. You don't decorate a garment because people are not supposed to see it. You decorate it because that information is supposed to be conveyed. So when you're talking to a client, you can tell them, okay, here's the handshake distance. If you have to, you even put a tape mark on the floor and a clip on the wall, and you say, I'm going to put your sample up and have you walk back, or your art, and scale that art to size, and have you walk back to that, say, 3 foot distance, or hey, the 4 foot distance. and say, okay, now that you're looking at it from here, does it look good, number one? Number two, can you read the things that you want to read from the logo? If they can't read those things at 3 feet and they are important bits of information that they want to communicate to the person who's looking at the garment, the likelihood is they need to make that text larger. Sometimes it means pulling text out of a logo or a seal or a badge and adding it as a drop text underneath or around the logo. And sometimes what you find out is that the text or the detail or anything that's running too small for you, this doesn't just have to be about text, is actually not that important to your client. And if it's not that important to your client, you can drop it entirely or maybe insinuate that it's there using some other technique and not stress so much on making this incredibly tiny text. I mean, it looks lovely when you get up close to the garment or hold it up to your face and you can see it very clearly, and it looks great. And sometimes that high quality can be part of your unique value proposition. However, when you're talking to a client who's specifically using this for promotions to get information out there or expects that that's what's going to happen, they may be better served by not using the small text at all. And I like to show a couple examples from the place that I used to work, and I actually did this to show this before when I wasn't using client imagery. What looks fine up close may be illegible at 3 to 4 feet away. So this is something where we're looking at it from, say 1 foot and then 3 feet. If you were expecting that someone was going to read the address for your website or read your phone number, which some people really think people are going to do on their left chest or on their hat, then having it so small that that it's not legible, or having, say, like here, the title of what your business does, so small, so cluttered, that it's not legible at that 3 to 4 feet, then you need to do something to either make it bigger, or you have to decide if it's important. And showing someone a visual, a graphic example like this, and I'm sure you guys out there who are digitizing and designing, you can make one of these yourself to kind of show people what's going on. There is this bottom limit after which people really can't see what you're trying to present. And truthfully, I'm just going to be honest, as someone who is a consumer myself, I have never in my life, even despite the fact that I am an embroidery person and have been for almost 20 years, taken down a phone number from someone's chest or written down a web address from the back of their hat. It's great if you want to do it for your own promotion. If it's something you just want to have there, I've created tons of them. I've stitched them all over the place. But personally, I find that if I've got a client who really thinks that we're going to have someone taking down information from their shirt, I tend to tell them that it's not the best idea. And I ask them that very question: how many times have you written down or tried to remember a web address from someone's garment? How many times have you written down a phone number or, something other pertinent information from their garment? I know there are some places where, say, if you've got a licensing number and it has to be displayed everywhere, some people like to display their license number, or it's a proof that they are professionals, and that's a reason why you might have some small numbering or lettering somewhere on your garment. But when we're talking about trying to communicate something like the address of your website or the phone number that you have, I don't particularly think they're all that useful. But when I have a client who absolutely just feels that they must be there, then I make them go ahead and check out that handshake distance to make sure they're being served in the fact that when someone is at that normal distance that they will be away from a stranger or someone in a service position, that they can actually read the thing the person's trying to get across. So, in conclusion, to wrap up all this small text talk, the best thing you can do, especially when you're dealing with text that is from the keyboard lettering, you want to start with text digitized and compensated at the proper size if possible. Now, if you're digitizing yourself, that's the best thing. If you can get capable enough, even if you never digitize a logo, to do some text work, I think it's great for everybody who edits and digitizes to definitely do text work themselves and figure that out, because it also allows you to match the proper fonts that are in someone's logo instead of replacing them with random keyboard lettering. I think it's something that tends to look a little lazy, and if your competitor uses their actual fonts instead of keyboard lettering, they're probably going to win out, because that fidelity will be important to some folks. But in any case, you want to start as much as you can with text digitized and compensated at size if possible, or to go with those second best choices that are open, that allow for a lot of sized variation without closing up or getting too small. Keep things open and follow those safe guidelines. If you're concerned about making something work, or say you've got a customer, especially if you're working with customer supplied garments where they're going to bring in multiple garments that have different textures, different thicknesses, and run differently, if you follow those safe guidelines and keep things to that 5mm size, you're more likely to have a good result than if you don't. So Is it possible to go underneath that 5 millimeters? Absolutely it is. If you're working on 40 weight thread and you want to be sure you're going to get something, stay above that 5 millimeters with your smallest letter. Remember, that includes if you've got mixed case or title case, that's going to be your smallest lowercase letter, not your smallest uppercase letter, at that 5 millimeters or above. Consider using thinner thread and needles for finer detail. And in fact, one of the things I always like to bring up, if you ever look at badge or patch manufacturers and you wonder, because there's a lot of people who say, oh wow, this patch looks really great, but I can't get my logo to look like that. A lot of them will run that 60-weight on everything. If you do stock a bunch of colors in 60-weight thread, you can get some incredibly fine detail and some really cool looking designs. And also, there's a great digitizer I know out there. I'll actually name him. Rich Medcraft is a guy who I've worked with before, done some webinars with before, and he always likes to show pieces with automotive designs and small left chest automotive designs. The grills look really nice. The spokes and the wheels, if he's got like wire spoke wheels, look really nice. And the way he gets that done is his outlining and his detailing is done with 60-weight thread. So consider using that thinner thread both for the small lettering and for fine detail if you're a digitizer. It is a really cool tool to use if you haven't used it before. It's worth trying out and learning. But you don't have to start big. You can start with your top 5 colors. Keep a couple needles per head set up and get your tensions right and get it running correctly on small thread, and then you don't have to mess with it all the time. So think about that when you start out. Keep a couple needles working or even one needle set up on that 60-weight thread and just keep your top 5 colors. And always work with your customer to determine the best, clearest option for their branding. Just because we can make lettering that's 3 millimeters tall doesn't mean we should. So now that you've learned a bit about it, or if you do some of these techniques, you find out you can get really small lettering, you can push it even beyond the barriers I kind of showed you in the safe guidelines. That's great. Do it. It looks cool. But remember that sometimes it's not the best option for folks. Inside of logos or seals, where really the seal is one thing unto itself and needs to have that text as part of it to look correct, that's one reason to use very small text. But when you're talking about things that are support text or, like we saw before, titles or something that's supposed to be read by someone viewing the piece, have them think about whether or not they want that to be legible, show them the handshake distance, and decide, is this the best option for my branding, and will I communicate what I want to communicate to the end viewer?